The night was eerily quiet in the outskirts of Kiev, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath. A lone soldier, his uniform caked in dust and sweat, adjusted his rifle and scanned the empty street ahead. He had seen this road countless times before, but tonight it felt different. There were no distant voices, no humming of generators, not even the occasional bark of a stray dog. It was as if the city had braced itself for something inevitable, something it could not escape. Miles away, in a dimly lit war room, intelligence analysts sat hunched over screens, piecing together satellite images, intercepted communications, and troop movements. The patterns were impossible to ignore. Reinforcements massing along key strategic points, new missile systems being deployed, and supply lines stretching further than they ever had before. The escalation was no longer a question of if, but when. One analyst, a seasoned veteran who had seen conflicts unfold in ways the public never would, rubbed his temples and exhaled sharply. "This isn't posturing," he muttered under his breath. "This is preparation." In Moscow, inside a heavily secured compound, advisors spoke in hushed voices, their words measured, calculated. A plan was forming, one that, if executed, would send shockwaves through the global stage. The pressure was mounting and decisions were being made that could not be undone. Leaders stood before maps, their fingers tracing borders, their expressions unreadable. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the consequences would be irreversible. Meanwhile, on the ground in eastern Ukraine, civilians rushed to stock up on supplies, their faces etched with worry. Some had seen this before, the slow creeping tension that turned into something far worse. Others, younger and less accustomed to war, clung to a fragile hope that diplomacy might still prevail. A mother pulled her child close as she watched a convoy of military vehicles rumble past her apartment window, their tires kicking up dust in the dim glow of the streetlights. The child, too young to fully understand, whispered a question that sent a shiver down her spine. "Will there be bombs again?" Across the ocean, in Washington and Brussels, discussions behind closed doors grew more urgent. Intelligence briefings became more frequent, and officials scrambled to assess what options remained. Lines had already been drawn, alliances reaffirmed, and yet the situation was evolving in ways that even the most experienced strategists found unsettling. How far was too far? When did deterrence become provocation? The answers were unclear, and the clock was ticking. A drone operator stationed in a classified location stared at his screen, tracking movements in real time. His hands hovered over the controls, steady yet tense. He had spent years in this role, watching conflicts unfold from a distance, making decisions that carried immense weight. Tonight, his orders were simple: observe, report, and be ready. But even through the cold detachment of the screen, he could feel it, the shift, the inevitability of what was coming. Then suddenly, a blip on the radar. A convoy moving where there shouldn't be one. A coded message intercepted, its contents sending a chill through the intelligence community. This wasn't just another maneuver. This was a signal. The pieces were falling into place, and soon the world would wake up to headlines that would reshape history. Back in Kiev, the soldier tightened his grip on his weapon as the distant sound of engines broke the silence. He exchanged a glance with his unit, no words necessary. They had trained for this, prepared for this. And yet, nothing could truly prepare a person for what came next. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. The night would not remain quiet for long. The engines in the distance grew louder, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The soldier knew better than to rely on sound alone. War had taught him that much. He pressed himself against the wall of a building, glancing at his unit. They were ready, but there was something in the air tonight. something unspoken yet understood. They weren't just bracing for an attack. They were waiting for a shift, a moment when everything they had known about this war would change. In the dim glow of streetlights, shadows stretched unnaturally across the pavement as armored vehicles crept forward. The soldier's breathing slowed. Every nerve in his body was telling him to move, to react, but orders were orders. Hold position. Observe. Do not engage unless necessary. Yet deep down, he knew, soon, it would be necessary. Inside a command center buried beneath the city, screens flickered with live satellite feeds and intercepted transmissions. The officers in charge had spent years in these rooms, analyzing threats, predicting enemy movements. But tonight, nothing felt predictable. There was a pattern emerging, a shift in strategy that didn't match previous operations. One officer, a hardened strategist with tired eyes, leaned over a console, his fingers tapping restlessly against the desk. "Something's off," he muttered. His colleague, younger but just as sharp, nodded without looking up from his screen. "This isn't a regular push," he agreed. "They're testing something." Thousands of miles away, in an underground intelligence hub, analysts were reaching the same conclusion. Pieces of information were coming together at an alarming rate. Drones captured unusual movements near key locations. Unverified reports hinted at reinforcements arriving under the cover of darkness. A communication intercepted hours earlier had contained an unfamiliar code, one that had taken analysts years to decipher. And now, as they ran the latest data through their systems, the truth was becoming clear. This wasn't just another escalation. It was something much bigger. On the streets of Kiev, civilians moved about with forced normalcy, their expressions betraying what they tried to suppress. They had learned to live with uncertainty, with air raid sirens that could shatter the night at any moment. But this time, the unease was different. There was no official announcement, no televised warning, yet the city seemed to sense it. Something was coming. A shopkeeper sweeping the front of his store paused, glancing up at the sky as if expecting an answer. A father hurried his children inside, his movements careful but urgent. Further east, near the front lines, the tension was even more palpable. Soldiers checked their gear with practiced efficiency, knowing they might have to move at a moment's notice. A young recruit, barely out of training, tightened the straps on his vest, his hands trembling slightly. An older soldier beside him gave a reassuring nod, though his own grip on his rifle was firm. Experience had taught him how quickly the ground could shift beneath their feet. As night deepened, the conflict was no longer just one of strategy and intelligence. It was a battle of patience, of waiting for the inevitable. Leaders on both sides were making choices in rooms far from the battlefield, decisions that would send ripples through history. In Washington, a meeting ran late into the night, voices hushed but urgent. How far would this go? How much longer could diplomacy hold? The answers were unclear, but hesitation was no longer an option. Back on the streets of Kiev, the soldier exhaled slowly, his grip steadying. The vehicles in the distance had stopped, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. A moment passed, then another, and then, just as he thought the silence might stretch on forever, a single light flickered on. A signal, a warning. Something had begun. The light in the distance pulsed once, then disappeared. For a brief second, the soldier thought he had imagined it, but then a second flicker came, this time lower, closer to the ground. A signal. The message was clear. Something was about to happen. He shifted his weight, gripping his rifle a little tighter as he exchanged a glance with the soldier next to him. No words were spoken, but they understood each other. The waiting was over. Across the city, similar signals were being received. In a makeshift operations room, hidden beneath a bombed-out building, A team of intelligence officers monitored encrypted communications. One of them, a woman with a deep crease between her brows, adjusted the earpiece she was listening through. The reports were coming faster now. Sightings of new troop movements, unfamiliar insignias on uniforms, encrypted chatter that suggested something large-scale was in motion. She turned to the officer next to her. This isn't routine. They're positioning for something bigger. In the east, near the front lines, another group was coming to the same realization. A convoy had been spotted moving under the cover of darkness, but it wasn't just another resupply run. The pattern of movement suggested an offensive was being prepared. A seasoned commander, his face weathered by years of battle, studied the reports carefully. He had seen many maneuvers like this before, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just a tactical repositioning, it was the prelude to a storm. He turned to his second-in-command. "Get the men ready. We don't wait for the first strike." As the night deepened in a quiet residential district, a journalist sat by her window, her fingers hovering over the keyboard of her laptop. She had spent years covering the war, but this was unlike anything she had seen before. She had sources on the ground, friends embedded with troops, and the messages she was receiving were alarming. One source, a longtime military contact, had sent a single text. "Something's coming. Get out if you can." Her stomach tightened. She had promised herself she wouldn't leave. This was her home, her city. But tonight, for the first time, she felt an undeniable urge to run. Thousands of miles away, in a high-security briefing room, global leaders were assessing their options. Satellite images told a story that words could not. There were new positions, new deployments, and a sense of urgency in the way forces were mobilizing. A diplomat leaned forward, his voice measured but firm. "We need to decide now. If we hesitate, we may not get another chance." Another official, older and more cautious, exhaled slowly. "And if we act too soon, we risk making this even worse." The debate raged on, but the truth was clear. Time was running out. Back in the city, the streets were eerily silent. Civilians who had once tried to go about their daily lives now stayed inside, their windows dark, their doors locked. A group of volunteers worked quickly in a small warehouse, packing medical supplies, food, anything that might be needed in the coming days. A doctor among them, exhausted but determined, double-checked the inventory. "This won't be enough," she muttered, mostly to herself. A young volunteer beside her, barely out of university, swallowed hard. "It has to be." In the darkness, the soldier on the front line shifted again, his muscles coiled, his breath steady. The signal had been given. Somewhere beyond the horizon, decisions were being made that would determine the course of the night, maybe even the course of history. But here in this moment, there was no time for politics, no space for debate. There was only the cold steel of his weapon, the pounding of his heart, and the knowledge that, by dawn, everything could be different. The silence before the storm was always the hardest part. The soldier's grip on his weapon tightened as he scanned the tree line ahead. He could feel the tension in his body, the way every muscle stayed coiled, ready. His earpiece crackled, brief static, then a voice, low but urgent. Movement confirmed. Stand by. His breath slowed. Any second now. Miles away, in the hidden operations room, the intelligence officer monitored the screens, her fingers tapping anxiously against the desk. She had spent years decoding patterns, predicting movements, analyzing strategies. But this time, something felt off. The enemy wasn't just advancing. They were moving with precision, like they already knew the response they'd get. A thought struck her, a chilling realization she couldn't ignore. They're one step ahead. She turned to the commander beside her. "We need to change the plan. Now." The commander barely reacted, his face hardened by experience. He had felt it too. There was an unpredictability to this escalation, something that defied the usual tactics. He spoke calmly into his radio, sending quiet orders that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Reposition. Hold fire until my command. His men, scattered across the front, listened, adjusted, and waited. In the city, the journalist rushed down the stairs of her building, her bag slung over her shoulder, her phone buzzing constantly with incoming messages. She had spent too long debating whether to leave, and now she wasn't sure if she had waited too long. The streets, once filled with the sounds of life, cars, voices, distant laughter, were now disturbingly empty. A few figures moved in the shadows, but they weren't civilians. She recognized the way they moved, trained, purposeful, and they weren't wearing the uniforms of the city's defenders. At the same time, the doctor at the makeshift supply station was met with a fresh wave of casualties. The first signs of battle. Shaking hands, rushed bandages, whispered reassurances. But she knew this was only the beginning. A medic beside her glanced toward the darkened horizon. We won't be able to keep up if it gets worse. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. And in the high-security briefing room, the debate had reached a boiling point. One official slammed his hand against the table. We have no choice. We intervene now, or we watch it all fall apart. Another, more cautious, shook his head. We don't know what we're walking into. We could be playing right into their hands. The decision loomed over them like a storm cloud, waiting to break. Back on the front line, the soldier could feel it. The final moment before everything changed. A distant rumble, a low growing sound, signaled movement in the distance. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then in the blink of an eye, the night erupted. A flash. A roar. The world around him burst into chaos. The explosion sent a shockwave through the ground, rattling the soldier's bones as he threw himself flat against the dirt. Dust and debris clouded his vision, but through the chaos, he heard the unmistakable sound of incoming fire. His radio crackled to life, shouts, overlapping voices, confusion. Then the commander's voice cut through the noise, calm but firm. Hold your position. Do not engage unless necessary. But it was already too late. The enemy had moved faster than expected, pushing forward with a strategy that felt too precise, too calculated. It wasn't just a battle anymore, it was a trap. In the intelligence center, the officer's fingers flew across the keyboard as she scanned the intercepted communications. Something was wrong. The patterns, the timing, the way the enemy maneuvered, it all pointed to one thing: a leak. Somewhere, somehow, the enemy had access to their plans. Her stomach tightened as she turned to the commander. They know our every move before we make it. We have to assume our strategy has been compromised. The commander's jaw clenched. Find the source. Now. In the city, the journalist ducked into an alleyway, her heart pounding. The figures she had seen earlier were no longer in the shadows. They were moving through the streets, taking positions, waiting. But for what? Her phone buzzed again, a message from a trusted source. She opened it and felt her breath hitch. Evacuate immediately. Major strike incoming. The realization hit her like a punch. The city wasn't just at risk of being caught in the conflict. It was the target. At the medical station, the doctor paused mid-stitch, her hands stained with blood. A new wave of wounded had arrived, and the reports coming in were worse than before. The attacks were shifting, becoming more erratic, but also more devastating. She could see it in the eyes of the injured. This wasn't just another offensive. It was something bigger. A medic ran up to her, breathless. We need to move the patients. Now, she didn't ask why. She just nodded, already knowing the answer. In the briefing room, the argument had reached its breaking point. The officials weren't just debating strategy anymore. They were questioning their own people. If the enemy knows our plans, that means someone is feeding them information. One of them said, his voice sharp. Another shook his head. We don't have proof. The first man leaned forward. Then why are they always ahead of us? Why do they know where to strike before we do? Silence. The answer was clear, but no one wanted to say it. There was a traitor among them. Back on the battlefield, the soldier had barely regained his footing when another explosion rocked the ground, closer this time. The enemy was advancing, but something about their movements felt different. They weren't pushing forward to take territory. They were driving them back, herding them into a tighter position. His stomach twisted as the realization dawned. They weren't just fighting a battle. They were being corralled toward something. And whatever it was, they weren't meant to survive it. As the enemy closed in and the city braced for impact, the truth became undeniable. The war had entered a new phase, one that no one was prepared for. And the worst part, the real danger wasn't just the attacks or the advancing forces. It was the unknown force pulling the strings from the shadows. The soldier pressed himself against the shattered wall, gripping his rifle as the air filled with the sounds of distant gunfire and echoing explosions. The enemy had forced them into a corner, pushing them back with precision that no ordinary force should have had. His mind raced. There had to be something they were missing, some hidden objective behind the relentless attack. Then the radio crackled with a frantic voice. They're not here for us. They're after something else. Pull back now. At the intelligence center, the officer's hands shook as she analyzed the latest intercepted messages. The patterns she had been tracking weren't just strategic movements. They were coordinated signals leading to a single location. It wasn't just about gaining ground. The enemy was after something specific. Her heart pounded as she cross-referenced the coordinates. Then her breath caught. "Commander," she whispered, turning to him with wide eyes. "They're not targeting the city. They're targeting the vault." The journalist ran through the smoke-filled streets, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. The message she had received still burned in her mind. They're going for the vault. Evacuate civilians immediately. But why? What was so important that the enemy would launch an entire operation just to reach it? She spotted a group of soldiers securing a building and rushed toward them. "You need to get people out of here." Now, one of the soldiers turned, confused. "Why? We still have defenses set up." She shook her head. "They don't care about the defenses. They're after something else. And if we don't move, we'll all be collateral damage." In the medical station, the doctor worked tirelessly, stitching wounds, giving orders, trying to keep herself from thinking about the growing tremors in the ground. Something big was happening outside, something worse than what they had already seen. A young medic rushed in, breathless. "Doctor, we have to go. They're moving toward the vault, and command says we need to clear the area." She looked at the wounded, at the ones too weak to move. Her voice was calm, steady. "Then we take them with us." As the realization spread through the ranks, orders were shouted, movements became frantic. The enemy's true objective had been hidden in plain sight all along. The vault, rumored to hold critical intelligence, war strategies, and perhaps even classified technology, was now the center of the conflict. The enemy wasn't just trying to win the battle. They were trying to shift the entire war in their favor. The soldier leading the defensive line saw the enemy regrouping, preparing for their final push toward the vault. He knew they were outnumbered, but retreat wasn't an option anymore. "We hold the line," he called to his men. "No matter what." He adjusted his grip on his rifle, breathing deeply. This was it. The final stand. Then the unexpected happened. Just as the enemy forces moved in, a series of explosions erupted behind them. For a moment, everything froze. Confusion rippled through their ranks as smoke and fire engulfed their rear lines. The soldier's radio crackled with a new voice, one he hadn't heard before. "You didn't think we'd let you have all the fun, did you?" Reinforcements. A faction they had written off as lost had returned, striking from the shadows at the perfect moment. At the intelligence center, the officer watched the live feeds in shock. "Who authorized that strike?" she asked. The commander gave a small, knowing smile. Sometimes the best moves aren't written in the plans. As the battle raged on, the tide turned. The enemy, caught between two forces, began to fall apart. The city was still standing. The vault was still secure. And for the first time in weeks, the defenders had hope. But as the dust settled, one final message came through on the intercepted channels. A simple sentence that sent a chill down everyone's spine. This was only the beginning. The smoke hung thick in the air, settling over the battlefield like a ghostly shroud. Fire still burned in the distance, casting flickering shadows over the ruined streets. The soldier stood with his rifle lowered, watching as the last of the enemy forces retreated beyond the hills. The sounds of battle had faded, replaced by the eerie quiet that always followed a fight. They had won, at least for now. At the intelligence center, the officer leaned back in her chair, exhaustion evident on her face. The intercepted message still echoed in her mind. This was only the beginning. She replayed it, listening carefully, searching for any hidden meanings. But there was nothing. Just a stark warning that sent a chill down her spine. She turned to the commander. "What do we do now?" He exhaled slowly. "We prepare." The journalist made her way through the wreckage, phone in hand, recording the aftermath. She stopped to talk to a medic tending to the wounded. "You stayed behind," she said softly. The medic gave a tired nod. They needed help. We couldn't just leave them. The journalist captured it all: the destruction, the resilience, the quiet determination in the soldier's eyes. The world needed to see this. At the medical station, the doctor worked tirelessly, stitching wounds, easing pain, offering quiet reassurances. The young medic who had urged her to leave sat nearby, bandaging his own arm. "You saved a lot of people today," he said. She simply nodded. There was no time for reflection, not yet. There were still lives to save. As the soldier walked through the city, he saw civilians emerging from their hiding places. Some wept, others clung to their loved ones. A little girl ran past him, searching the crowd, and when she finally spotted her mother, she let out a cry of joy. The soldier felt something tighten in his chest. This was why they fought. The vault remained untouched, its secrets still locked away. The High Command sent in specialists to assess any damage, but the truth was clear. The enemy had come dangerously close to breaking in. What lay inside remained classified, but the implications were clear. This battle hadn't just been about territory or control. It had been about information, about power. And someone, somewhere, was still pulling the strings. That night, the city was quiet. The fires had been put out, the wounded had been tended to, and the dead had been mourned. Soldiers gathered in small groups, some talking in hushed tones, others simply staring at the sky. The soldier sat on a piece of broken concrete, cleaning his weapon out of habit. The journalist sat beside him. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. He didn't look up. "No, but we bought time." In the intelligence center, the officer studied the intercepted transmissions, searching for patterns. The enemy had fallen back, but they hadn't been defeated. Their message had been clear. This was only the beginning, but the question remained: Asterisk the beginning of what asterisk? Across the city, civilians and soldiers alike tried to return to some sense of normalcy. Children played in the streets again, vendors set up makeshift stalls, and life slowly, cautiously moved forward. But the scars of battle remained, on the buildings, on the people, on the land itself. As the sun began to rise, casting golden light over the war-torn city, a new day began. The war wasn't over, and the enemy would return. But for now, there was a moment of peace, and sometimes that was enough.